Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an in-depth look at the PC release of Naughty Dog's The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, and see how it compares visually to the game running on the PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 5 Pro hardware. For this video, the PC version is being run with the graphics settings maxed out at a 4K resolution. Though, to demonstrate the benefit of the PC platform more clearly, I've opted to disable upscaling options like DLSS and frame generation this time around, and opted to instead make use of DLAA, that, in theory, should improve the clarity of a 4K resolution with an AI-based anti-aliasing. Though, we'll discuss some of the minor hiccups I ran into using this option, along with the benefits of using other features like DLSS and frame generation as well, along with how the game performs across a few different generations of high-end PCs. Now, for this particular video, I've opted to use captured footage I already had on file of the PS5 running in Fidelity mode, as this technically is still the highest quality option available on the console. But I have captured a bit of PS5 Pro footage as well just in case, and in general, the differences are extremely minor, and boil down to things like the overall sharpness of the image. So let's kick this comparison off by first checking to see if there's been any changes to the character models. At first glance, not much has changed here, and that's not too surprising as there were very minimal changes made to the characters like Ellie when the initial remaster of this game had released, save for some improved sharpness and higher res textures. But from PS5 to PC, these differences are even more slight. Ellie looks nearly identical. That is, unless you switch to DLAA on the PC and zoom in extremely close. It's still minor, but you'll find very fine details like her hair are resolved a tiny bit more cleanly, with a similar pixelation occurring, but not quite as frequently as what you'd get on the PS5 in Fidelity mode. PSSR on PS5 Pro helps to hide this pixelation when it's upscaling the image, but as far as a native output versus DLAA on PC, your best possible image looks to be coming from the PC. Though again, this is when we're zoomed in extremely close. You're likely not going to notice a change this small at a default view distance. But it's small changes like this incrementally and together that benefit the overall presentation. Another change you may have already picked up on is a slight variance in the coloration. At first, I thought this might just be due to the specific location Ellie was standing, or the dynamic clouds that cast shadows on the environment that impact the brightness, or maybe even how the capture card had captured footage on PS5. But I believe this might have something to do with the way the PC version is rendering shadows in general, as there's a few other areas where shadows aren't quite as dark as they were on PS5, impacting the clarity of projections and brightness of the image. The shadow projections on Ellie, for example, look like they're in approximately the same location on her skin, but they're much lighter on PC, whereas you get a more contrast-heavy look on PS5, with more of that detail in Ellie's face standing out. An aspect that, again, I feel may be attributed to a slight change in the quality of the lighting here. Next, let's take a look at the changes that were made to the environments. Now, when jumping from the PS4 to PS5, the biggest observable change I identified was the improved draw distance for details like vegetation, a common scalable feature in many of these PlayStation to PC ports. And in general, you can expect to see increased LOD on the PC, with higher res textures and meshes appearing from far greater distances, making wide shots through the Seattle area much better at higher resolutions. Up close, you're not going to see too much of a benefit here. Texture maps are all the same as before, decent but nothing too amazing. And it is a shame that we couldn't see any improvements here considering some of the muddy PS4 era textures are still at play. Though it's generally covered up well with additional meshes and other assets like grass, that thankfully is improved a great deal. Grass in general is much sharper on PC, turning what were slightly more blocky looking patches of grass on PS5 to much cleaner individual blades of grass, and typically, patches of this grass will render at a greater distance too, making scenes like this one appear practically flawless, with no perceivable pop-in past the line of cars along the highway. However, I was surprised to find some occasional instances where the PS5 version rendered certain terrain decor like grass and flowers from a greater distance, like this line of purple flowers on the hillside that pops in much later on the PC. In fact, I found a lot of detail in the scene to be superior on the PS5 too, like those distant skyscrapers, windows, and the synagogue, that are being rendered much more clearly, despite similar wide shots throughout clearly favoring the PC version. My guess is that these details are taking a bit longer to stream onto the PC's M.2 than the PS5's internal storage solution when entering the valley for the first time, though it's still odd considering how long I was already standing in this valley before hitting record anyway. Next, we have lighting. In theory, the lighting here should be completely identical. All the light techniques between these two versions are at play, with the same high-quality baked light maps used to simulate bounce lighting, combined with actual simulated bounce lighting for dynamic lighting like the player's flashlight, and other techniques like screen-based subsurface scattering and a combination of image-based lighting, screen space reflections, and planar reflections throughout. Every one of these techniques are at play in the PC version too, and continue to look just as beautiful as they did on the console. Lighting is executed extremely well all throughout this game, with thick light shafts pouring in through cracks in ceilings, moody color tones that match up with the emotional impact of the scene, and bounce lighting coming off of certain light sources like the flashlight, that help to further enhance scenes where you're sneaking around dark basements filled with the infected. The PC version also seems to benefit from some thicker light shafts than its PS5 counterpart, which is most evident in this opening forest section, where additional rays of light can be seen coming through the tree canopy. There's some slight changes to how light seems to interact with materials, with the ground here not showing as much bloom as before. And as we mentioned before, the surface of character skin seems to absorb more light than before, which helps to explain why we're seeing a little bit less of that detail come through. But the overall tone of the game remains more or less consistent in that regard, and the changes boil down more to the adjustment to bloom and higher quality subsurface scattering, rather than an intentional change to the look of these characters or scene lighting. I did run into a few other, likely unintentional problems with the PC version, like this one interior area where the flashlight's bounce lighting seems to just disable the light maps in this corner. And then there's this one blood texture in this apartment building that for whatever reason isn't reacting properly to the light coming in through the window, turning it into this black smear on the ground instead of the proper reflective red we see on the console. But the changes to the lighting aren't all negative. The PC version does at least benefit from higher fidelity screen space reflections, most evident when looking at this pool here. And cube map reflections, like those seen in puddles along the road, are less pixelated as well, which together help to create a more convincing presentation in the more rainy sequences of the game. Shadows are another interesting area, where I believe the change to the way light interacts with material seems to have impacted the clarity of the shadow projections themselves. This shadow of a power line, for example, isn't quite as pronounced on PC, even though the projection itself is much less pixelated in general, and has an even more realistic softness to it. But then you have angles like this, where this nice shadow projection is basically being lost in the image, barely visible along the surface of the road, making it more difficult to make out the slight movement of the tree branches that previously looked very nice here. At the same time, shadow quality is improved overall, removing that pixelated shimmer you get on the PS5 Fidelity mode, and maintaining a cleaner yet still soft projection on the PC. And shadow render distance, like the object render distance, is bumped up a good amount too, which helps to accentuate distant details like signs and architectural details in wide-angle shots. When it comes to miscellaneous effects, the differences seem to favor the PC version in most instances. Water surface textures are improved overall, which helps to improve the presentation of the many rivers and puddles throughout the game, which have already been improved with their enhanced reflective properties too. Particle density is also scaled up a bit on PC, and benefits from the PC version's improved clarity to make sequences with lots of effects on screen stand out more clearly. However, Fire Alphas look to be about the same as before, which is a shame as there's some Fire Alphas that look very pixelated when viewed up close. You'll also notice that the PC version is missing that bright radial bloom effect around these fires. Whether or not this is an improvement, I'd argue boils down to personal preference, but I'm not sure this bloom being removed is intentional or not, as it does seem to lessen the intensity of certain fires when viewed up close. And it also seemed to work hand in hand with the game's camera lens post-processing effects, like the rain droplets that refract some of the light, that we're not seeing anymore on the PC. Finally, we have performance. This is the big question here, as The Last of Us Part 1 on PC came out of the gate stumbling pretty hard with its poor performance and instability. Though, thanks to the efforts of this particular port's developer, Nixxes, Part 2 on the PC is off to a much stronger start. I tested this on a variety of computer configurations, and I found that the game runs fairly stable across the board. The game runs buttery smooth, with none of that horrible stutter found in Part 1. What's more, I was getting great performance without having to rely on DLSS or frame generation at all. I played most of the game using a 4090 at max settings 4K with DLAA enabled, and I was getting around 100 FPS on average, with that average dropping down to maybe 80 frames per second in the more densely vegetated areas. With the 3090, I was averaging much lower, at around 60 frames per second at 4K, occasionally dipping to the mid-50s. But even still, performance was stable and still looked better than that PS5 version. And of course, when playing with the newer 5090, I was seeing frame rates well above 100 frames per second, even higher with DLSS and frame gen enabled, forcing me to limit the frame rate just to avoid the GPU's coil whining. GPU wattage also sat at around 300 to 400, sometimes pulling 500 in more demanding sequences. But temperatures remained decent throughout, and the frame rate and frame pacing felt great in every instance. All that being said, I did have the game crash on me a few times. Once when transitioning between cutscenes towards the beginning, and again during the second flashback sequence with Ellie and Joel at the hotel. There's also a few minor graphical bugs I mentioned earlier, like facial hair flickering in certain cinematics or that light map issue. It's also frustrating that this game, like many on the PC, once again does not seem to be supporting the DualSense Edge controller, forcing me to use either a standard DualSense or an Xbox controller just to play. And if you do run into issues with a controller and need to swap them out, the game doesn't recognize a new input, forcing you to restart the client to get that new controller to be recognized. But other than those issues, I found The Last of Us Part 2 on PC to be a fairly competent port of a PS4 classic, and absolutely worthwhile for PC gamers looking forward to experiencing the next chapter in the story. Now, because there's no real difference in the sound quality here that I could notice, I'm going to forego the typical sound comparison section for this video. Though if you guys haven't checked it out yet, please be sure to check out my full documentary on the history of The Last of Us, which details the full development history of both games, along with their subsequent ports and the HBO show, the latter of which will be airing Season 2 soon. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for new documentaries, reviews, and direct comparisons posted every week.